And what you should be able to see now is the front page or the entry dashboard of Smart Curriculum. This is a sample school. It's real data from a live school, but it's set up as a sample. Just move it down. So we're going to focus today on curriculum enhancement and what's going on within staffing. And I have to say, what we see with a lot of schools when we begin this process of review is that this support hours looks very much like it is here. We are very good at describing the bought number of hours. So we can, the top chart here, which shows you the full detail, has got the amount of bought teacher time, which is the sum of the allocations across the teaching staff. And we have spent a lot of time putting in your curriculum. So you've got your number of curriculum hours, and we can compare the two. Now we're going to concentrate on this support element just to finish off how you are showing your curriculum. Now, if you've got some questions about the others, well, again, we can come back to those towards the end. So this school, which is not untypical, has shown the number of bought hours of their support staff. Now, remember, we have two definitions, and it's standard across all schools for support and administration. What we're talking about with support staff is all of the people we would describe as teaching assistants, learning supervisors, LSAs, and there are a plethora of descriptions, but they are people contractually who are teaching assistants or HLTAs, higher level teaching assistants. We are very good at describing their the hours that we contract them for, but how do we describe what they do? So in the same way that in the taught curriculum, the teacher taught curriculum, we have defined a range of subjects. We've named a list of subjects and we can assign those to a year group. And we are familiar with the fact that there is a teaching ratio that we are targeting. Now, the standard teaching ratio that we're working to is 1 to 27. Now, in your data entry hub, if you are going to change that pupil-teacher ratio, we would go to our class size modeling and we would change it. Now, in this one, the default for all of them is 27, and it's been changed up to 28 in Key Stage 3, down to 26 in Key Stage 4, and although it's been written in as 17, it is defaulted to 17 in the sixth form. Now, that's based on the DFE and EFSA data, and you will be aware that within the School Resource Management Advisors checklist that they put out in October, they have now set a range. So where we've been talking about a pupil-teacher ratio in most schools about 1 to 17, that's now, rather than that rather broad stroke, although the last studies suggested it is growing, it's rising, and was around 117.6 last time they did the study. They're now projecting the average class sizes of different types of school. And I think the lowest we're seeing was 19, and the highest average was around 23.5. So that 19 to 23.5 is the kind of range on average that we are seeing. But these schools have, as a point of measurement, have been put in. So we're used to this idea of an adult to a group of children. Now, in the provision mapping, we need to create something that's a little bit more bespoke. Now, often this is in the purview of the SENCO. And isn't necessarily well described, or at least in any point of time, simply because it changes quite often. But we're talking about a predictive system that is able to project what staffing we need for the need that's coming through. So what we've done is divide the support provision into two areas. The two areas are to describe what the provisions are and then describe them as a structure. And it's in fact exactly the same as if you see on the screen, the subjects down here. If I asked you to list a range of subjects that you deliver in your school, you would be able to do that very easily. and then put the curriculum structure together within this element here. So it's the same idea. The support provision, now we know on that chart that you've just looked at that there was nothing there. So there's no provision being described. So if I go into the support provision, what we have here is a list of subjects. Now I've borrowed these from a number of schools that we've been working from. There's a TA or an HLTA offering general support. Now the one difference between the support and the general teaching in the class is the contact ratio is different. So where we're looking, that's why I spent some time looking at that class and the 2027 as the average. In this case, general support in this school is offered to 1 to 3, so an adult to 3 children. One-to-one mentoring clearly is 1-to-1. ADHD mentor is delivered at 1-to-1. One of the schools has this thing called zones, and a member of staff is supervising 2 children. Sensory circuits is done 1-to-1. Math intervention is in small groups 1 to 4. Now you might have groups of 1 to 7, 1 to 10, 1 to 12, or whatever's going on. I've got one school that offers a chess club where they effectively are doing 1 to 16. So they run 4 chess boards with pairs of students working together. But in terms of our provision, rather than the standard class being 1 to 27 or 1 to 17 in the sixth form, we set the pupil staff ratio in this description. So here is my subject list effectively, and here is the ratio that we're going to work to. Now what a school would need to do would be to describe all of the provisions that the TAs and HLTAs are there to provide. Now I know lots of schools will say that's really difficult because it changes and there are multiple year groups and that works differently, but in any provision mapping and in any employment position, we need to know what it is that we're buying the people for. It gives you an evaluative point because we can say, well, this is working or it's not, but we could describe them. Now, there's nothing to say that during a year you wouldn't add more. There's nothing to say that as you go through the year you might stop doing some of them. But what you are doing is planning your quite expensive resource around the typical things that we would be doing. But the key factor here is that the provision, Dragons, is provided with 1 member of staff and it's intended to be 10 children. So we have our list. And if you look in the user guide, we are adding to that list quite often. So the typical things that people are using, we are exemplifying. So in this case, I've added all of those elements. So if I take out a couple of those, so general support and one-to-one mentoring, they're the ones that I'm going to focus on just to start with. So we've got our subject list effectively. Now back in the hub, how do we then move, sorry, I'm just going to go back. So how do we get this so that it's now populated? So what we really need to do is to be able to say, well, this is what's happening. So it's empty. Clearly there's nothing going on at the moment. So what I'm going to do in the same way across all of the app, we've now got this list of provisions. I said I was going to concentrate on those at the top. So the one-to-one curriculum support. Now let's say there's one-to-one support going on and I've got 10 students in year 7 who are receiving 2 hours a week. So I'm going to add year 7. Now the ratio will come through when it's saved, but that's already been entered. I've said I've got 10 students and they're getting 2 hours per week. If I save that, then 10 students getting a one-to-one provision of 2 hours a week means the support hours cost is 20 hours. So if I was to add more of those, so I want to do that across a number of year groups, I'll just drag that down. So I'm going to do the same. I'm going to add that to each of the year groups. And now I'm going to say, well, I've got 8 students in year 8. I've got 10 students in year 9. I've got 15 students in year 10 and 15 students in the year 11. It's not rocket science, but you can see, so maybe my year 8s have got 2 hours, and then I'm going to give them an hour a week for all of the others. So the total number of hours is 76 hours. So one-to-one curriculum support with a designated range of people is coming up with 76 hours. So now if I go back to the dashboard, we've now got 76 hours showing. So that's 76 of the 441 hours that we've bought are now designated for that purpose. So I go back to my data entry, looking at the support structure again. I've only used one particular element. So if I want to then go in and pick out something else, general support. So I've got general support for year 7. Now it might be that across the year group, I've got a number of students. Now remember, the general support was in class and it was on a ratio of 1 to 3. So if I've got 30 students, and so that's actually 10 sessions, and I'm going to do it across the whole week. So I've got 30 students get full-time support. That will be 250 hours because it's 25 hours, 30 students in a ratio of 1 to 10. Therefore, I need 250 hours to do that. So it may be, sorry, I'm going to flip back to my dashboard here. It may be now the 326 hours, I'm focusing that time. Now that was quite generous, and it may be that that's not what you would provide, but just for illustrative purposes, you can see how that's structured. So it may be that that's, you know, you've got less students, or you would not be offering them all of that time. And it would be unusual for a TA necessarily to be in class for 25 periods out of a week. Now notice the thing to say at that point, when we look at teacher cycles or teacher timetables, the teacher timetables are based on the cycle. So if it's a 2-week timetable, the allocations will be 19.5 times over a 39-week year. With support provision, all of support contracts are based on the number of weeks that they work. So if they're term time only, they may be on a 38-week contract. So this is why it has to be done separately from teaching. The contracts are done in such a way that this is considered to a single week cycle. Does that make sense to you in terms of how that might be done? Andy, I just seen your comment. Does it matter if support is given by a teacher? It's difficult to, I mean, that's one of the anomalies that we use. Now, if I go back to answer the question now, while we're here, does it matter? No, it doesn't. The question is how we show it. Now, in this school's terms, this school has got 303 surplus teaching periods. How the school chooses to use that time is entirely up to the school. Obviously, 303 teaching periods surplus with the cost of 2,720 per hour means that there's £400,000 sitting not doing much. So one would want that to be operated in doing something purposeful. If you timetable it in, because of the separation of those two elements, we wouldn't include that time in this provision. That's an incidental use of that time. Similarly, if you've got surplus here, particularly if you're in a primary setting, some of this time is often used to cover shortfalls here. So in a primary setting, you might have PPA provision where a support member of staff is being used for that. All we would do is describe that in this case, the 115 periods of surplus, you're buying that surplus, one would expect to see how that is used. Now, over this cycle, that 115 applies to a single week, where in this school, the 303 applies to 2-week timetable. So there is a separation of them. So does it matter? No. This is not a timetabling tool, it's an evaluative tool. It's saying you have surplus, how are you using it, or can you diminish that surplus? It may be that you're using the teacher's surplus to provide cover. That's therefore you would see supply cover, cost supply cover reducing. Second part of your question, if you're doubling up teachers, again, that's just an application of those, the surplus and how you're using it. It's, I suppose the question really comes down to it's not the granular level, it's the strategic level. Why is that 303 periods bought? Now, there would need to be an answer to that. If it's cover, that's an answer. If it's paired teaching to raise standards of teaching, that's another answer. If it's just we've got surplus and it's costing us £400,000, that's not an answer that most accountability frames would settle with. Now, I suppose the other question is, how much surplus do you need to deliver the timetable in terms of reducing split classes and so on? Well, there's another answer. If your timetable is such that you need to do that, then you would be using that surplus for that purpose. But coming back to the support hours, initially we were allowing you to use support time within teaching and teaching time within support. But to be honest, in terms of the calculation, it got so complex that we determined that it was actually not viable to continue doing so, because you couldn't see that curriculum time. Particularly in the primary setting, as I say, quite often you'll see this being a negative, and therefore support time is used for that purpose. Let's just go back to the support structure. What would you do if you had a mixed group of, let's say, a lunchtime club that's got year 7s and year 8s in it? Well, let's just explore what that might look like. So we have an after school club. I'll use that because it's at the top of the list. What we would say is, I've got 2 cohorts, maybe it's a class of 30 that are after school and they're involved in some form of activity. I'm going to say it's a group of 30 and there's 15 from each year group. Now, if that after school club lasts for an hour, in terms of the kind of work that that person might be doing, they would effectively be breaking it down. So we would be looking at half an hour with one year group and half an hour with the other group. You wouldn't actually be delivering it as such, because you would be delivering to the mass. But in terms of accounting for it, we need to show that the time you're giving is divided between those people. So if you've got multiple year groups in a group, you simply divide the time equally among them. Now, in terms of the support hours that are required to do that, you can see that's because we've got a 1.8. Let's make that a little easier. Just drop it up to 16, save it, and then that's 1. So they're getting half the time each. So if you've got multiple students in a group, you just simply put them in terms of their numbers and then divide the time down between them. Now, where have we got to with our dashboard? So now we've accounted for 328 teaching support teaching hours. We had 441 bought time. Now I'm just going to show where that is, just because we didn't cover that earlier. So I'm on the staffing grid. what you would need to do is to select my support people, and I've got 13 support people here. There are no TAs. They are all, sorry, no HLTAs. They're all TAs. And the support allocation hours per week has been added. So the number of hours per week, 441, you've recognized that familiar number. Now, we are doing some work on this in terms of making that it easier to handle the non-teaching staff FTE. So you will see in the next update there will be hours per week and contract hours per year come through, so that we can add that. I'll just add that as an aside. But can you see, you need to have added the hours per week in this section to be able to get that sum of hours. So some people that haven't got that blue box showing because they haven't put in the support allocation. Really important that that is coming through, because otherwise you won't see that element. Okay, so putting in their support hours. Now, this is an independent figure. The other thing we'll be looking at soon is how much of a proportion of the main hours, the issue of the main hours, how much of your base hours, so what's your contract hour for the week, if it is 37.5, which is fairly standard, then obviously 33 is a proportion of that, and that's what they're employed for. But you would need that list included. Now, we have seen a number of schools where they haven't actually put in the support hours, and that's why it's not showing. So that number of hours, sorry, that's just been there too long. So now we have a completed chart. Now, where does that data show in other places? There are a number of places where support hours will be showing. And if we come to cost per pupil, you notice, so in our chart, we had this great chunk of time for year 7s, and there was some time spread out for 9, 10, or so 8, 9, 10, and 11. That was the after school club and the one-to-one provision. In terms of the cost per pupil, we are now showing how we are using that money that we've got from you. So sorry, where you've put that time in, we can now see how that's distributed across the school. Again, on this chart, there are 3 elements that you'll need to enter. The ALPU, or the age-weighted pupil unit, that's on the global parameters. If you've put your staffing in and you've got your support staff, you can see how that staffing is being distributed. We're also working on some new charts that will show that distribution of how effective, or at least how you're using this range, of support type activities. That hopefully will be out during the next half term of this term. But you've got all these provisions that you've described, and then how that is used in proportion across the school.